Hello, everybody. Our share today is titled Zoharic Kabbalah as Mystical Resistance to Christianity. And for our share, I have drawn on the research of Professor Hartley Lachter. And we're going to be looking at medieval, specifically Zoharic, not necessarily Kabbalah from the Zohar, but Zoharic Kabbalah from that circle of Kabbalists who constructed a theology of resistance in response to negative Christian portrayals of Jewish people, particularly Jewish males. And they paint the picture through their literature, through this Christian polemic literature, of the Jewish body, particularly the male Jewish body, as being flawed, inferior, and weak. And in response, the Kabbalists developed a counter narrative where they paint the picture of the Jewish body as being sacred, resilient, holy, transcendent of time. And this new depiction that we find within the Kabbalah, within the Zoharic Kabbalah, Jews become, particularly Jewish males, become instruments of redemptive history, not just for Jews, but for the cosmos itself. And they turn accusations of faithlessness that the Christians leveled against the Jewish people for rejecting Jesus, they turn those accusations of faithlessness into affirmations of faithfulness to the divine mystery, to the true divine mystery. In other words, what they basically do is they go from an image of the Jew as being inferior to an image of the Jew being superior. And all this is achieved, as we shall see in this hypothesis, by the circle of Kabbalists living in northern Spain around about 13th and 14th century. So let's go into a little bit of a background to Jewish mysticism in general. Early Jewish mysticism and early Jewish philosophy, in other words, rationalism, once again, versus mysticism, these two traditions developed. Of course, you can say that they were always there, but history has a way of bringing things out and sharpening things at various periods of time. So when we talk about coming out in a certain era or in a certain century, doesn't mean, it suddenly abruptly emerged. These things, history flows, events flow into each other. But we look at moments where these things are highlighted and exaggerated. But Jewish mysticism and Jewish philosophy, those are two opposite ends of the Jewish narrative. The early mystical Jews and the early rationalist Jews, it was the followers of the Rambam, then later the followers of Kabbalah, because remember, Maimonides was about 85 years before the Kabbalah was first published in manuscript form in 1290. But this intellectual history developed predominantly in Islamic lands, particularly in the Al-Andalus, which is southern Spain, Islamic Spain, and other centers of Islamic rule. And these traditions, both mysticism, early mysticism, and early rationalism, reworked ideas that were already extant in the world. In other words, the Greeks had introduced the notion of Aristotelianism, which is something that Maimonides drew from, but they also introduced the notion of Neoplatonism, which was taken both from Plato and from Plotinus 500 years later, where Plato's ethical and ethereal thinking becomes slightly more systematized as a form of mysticism. And also they took from Sufi mysticism. And these rational and two different types of mysticism, Neoplatonicism and Sufism, were always presented in Arabic writings and in Arabic texts. And it came to the Jews, in a sense, in a second-hand manner from either Arabic text or translated from the Arabic. And this is by the own admission of the early mystics and the early rationalists, who tell us exactly where they took their sources from. So we received our mystical and our rational traditions to some extent, to perhaps some large extent. Obviously, we had our own mysticism, but everything is fluid, as we know. But we took a lot of our mystical and rational traditions from the Greeks via the Arabs. So it came to us, much of this literature came to us secondhand. But then the later Jewish mystics, now we move on after the period of Maimonides, and as we get into the period of the Zohar, because there were various forms of mysticism. There was Hechalot literature, Merkavah literature, there was the Bahir. As we move now towards the mysticism of the Zohar, this is the first time that our mysticism develops in Christian lands. And this accident of history is going to be very significant for us in our discussion today, because the Zohar emerges in Christian lands, in Christian Europe, particularly in Provence, which is southern France, and in northern Spain, which of course is Christian Spain. And within this predominantly Christian geography, we experienced influences from Christianity, and we also experienced persecutions from Christianity, terrible persecutions from Christianity, which, as you know, came to a head in the late 1300s and the late 1400s, eventually with the expulsions from Spain and Portugal. And in this sense, Jewish mysticism cannot be regarded as a continuum. In other words, it's not the same mysticism as we had when we were living in Islamic lands. It somehow, it certainly changed, the trajectory changed significantly when the geography changed and the predominant culture was now Christianity, which was in fact a persecuting culture for the Jews. So we can't read our mysticism, we can't say that the Zohar just carried on its merry way after the other forms of Jewish mysticism, because there was a sharp change in geography, but not just in the locale, but there was a sharp change in mindset and in the predominant settings of the surrounding environment, the cultural pressures. And particularly now, we had to deal with persecutions with very, very sharp Christian persecutions and Christian polemics. That means theological debates and challenges against the Jewish religion. And medieval Christian polemics against Judaism was focused on the image of the Jew as an inferior being, particularly the male Jew. The woman Jew, the female Jew, was not the target, was not always the target, was not the focus of the persecution. It was the Jewish male the image of the Jewish male was portrayed in the most negative ways imaginable. The male body was depicted by the Christian as being a site of difference, otherness, a site of weakness. Jews were much weaker than Christians, and even a site of pathology. Jews were ill. They had illnesses. They had physical illnesses, mental illnesses. And these images were designed to reinforce the superiority of the Christians, of those Christians who chose to partake in these polemics, and to marginalize the image of the Jews. The Jewish male body was flawed and weak. And in Christian literature, at that time, 12th, 13th centuries, the reason why the Jewish male was punished or was flawed was a punishment for the sin of deicide. That's the sin of killing a god. You have genocide, you have suicide, and then you have deicide. Deicide is when you kill a deity, when you kill a god. So because the Jews had killed the Christian God, they were now damned and doomed for all eternity, and they had to suffer this weakness, this degradation, as a result of the sin of deicide. And what the Christians did, and when I talk about Christians, I'm not talking about all Christians, I'm talking about the Christians who chose to partake in the polemics. What they did was they feminized the Jewish males. And they projected this terrible image that Jewish males suffered from monthly male menstruation. And this was their punishment for shedding the blood of Jesus. Because they drew blood from Jesus, they would now have blood drawn from them monthly, just like women. And they really believed this. The Christians, on the other hand, were contrasted against these weak male, feminized Jewish men. They were contrasted as being presented as soldiers of Christ in their literature, quote unquote. In other words, these were soldiers. These were fighters. These were strong men. Christian men were strong. They were clean. They were fully male, as opposed, and they were chaste. chaste. And they were contrasted this way against the deviant, dirty, feminized Jewish male. And the Jewish males were also presented as being morally deviant and morally corrupt. And this literature is widespread, and this led to persecutions. And it was a very difficult environment for Jews to survive in. So what did they do? Well, they developed a powerful counter-theology intended, amongst other things, to reconstruct the image, the negative image of the Jew, particularly the negative image and the embarrassing image of the Jewish male. And they took, as we shall see, aspects of Christian theology, inverted them, retold them within a Jewish mystical narrative, showing the superiority of the Jewish male over the Christian male and showing the superiority of the Jewish narrative in general over the Christian narrative and theology. Now, this becomes very interesting because we already know that Judaism is a patriarchal society. There's no ways we can get away from it. Yes, we know that women are higher than the men, but we all know, but bottom line, we can't count women towards a minion, etc., etc. We certainly, it's very difficult to argue that our society is not a patriarchal society, or was not, because things are slowly beginning to change, even within the Orthodox world. But that's not what we're really talking about here now. But patriarchy certainly shaped the Jewish narrative, particularly in the past. There's no ways we can get away from that. But now, with the emergence of the Zohar in the late 13th century, we add a nuance to that because we can understand why this patriarchy was emphasized within Judaism, because now we can understand how we had to build up the image of the male after it had been totally destroyed and distorted by Christian theology and by Christian polemics. And what the Zohar did and the Zoharic circles did, because they bore the brunt of this Christian persecution, is they took Christian ideas, inverted them, and reimagined them through a secret knowledge possessed by the mystics, which was then Kabbalah. By the way, before that we had Jewish mysticism. Kabbalah really only applies, the term Kabbalah really only applies from the moment the Zohar appears on the scene. And we have now we have a hidden Kabbalistic knowledge about the hidden powers of Jewish male bodies. And once again, they did this to counter the image that was projected in the Christian world, which is a very powerful world. There were Christian kings. Christianity was everywhere. It was a dominant force in society. And in this dominant force, there was a lot of Christian literature. And in that literature, the Christian males, particularly the clergy, which was very, very strong. Church and state were intertwined. And the clergy were depicted as rarefied spiritual beings. They wore special clothes. They wore bright clothes, white garments, purple garments. The Jews wore black. They were pure, clean people, as opposed to the image that they tried to present of the Jews: dark colors, carnal, physical, immoral, effeminate. And even Christian art depicted the Jew. The art from that time depicted the Jew, particularly the male Jew, as being grotesque and ugly. Christians always had pleasant faces. Jews stereotypically had, hooked noses and very ugly and drooling. And this image of the Jew found its way from Christian theology to medical treatises, because in the universities of the time, the medicine and the study of medicine involved the otherness of the Jew as well. Physiognomy was an important focus at that time. And if you could show that the Jew was physically different from Christians, that would match the narrative of the age. In other words, Jews weren't only theologically different. Not only was their religion different from Christianity, but their very bodies were other and different from Christian bodies. And the Jewish bodies were deficient. I mean, we just experienced this, just decades ago, where people were still believing that black brains and black bodies were physically different from white bodies. But in the literature back in the 13th century, here's a little extract from some of that literature. It's taken from Jacques de Vitry, 13th century. Jews do not make use of their arms. So, strong people have arms. When you see people strong, they walk with arms. Jews, their arms are weak. They just hang because they don't do anything. They don't need arms. They effeminate. They never need to use arms because they don't contribute anything. They don't make use of their arms. And also, like women every month, they suffer. And then he comes up with a quote, which I'm not going to read to you, but they say the reason why they suffer monthly, why Jewish males suffer monthly like women, is because they killed their brother, the true Abel, Jesus Christ. That's Abel. A lot of Christianity developed a Christological reading of the Torah, or what they call the Old Testament, where they read Jesus into the narratives of the Old Testament. So Abel became Jesus, and Cain, who killed Abel, became the Jews. So the Jews were Cain. The Jews were Cain. And ever since then, Jews, Jacques de Vitry continues, have walked around with trembling heads. And I think that this is an image, an image of Jews davening. They davening, their heads are moving, their heads are always trembling. They have a fearful heart. They shake night and day. Davening, they shake. Ever since then, it's part of the punishment. Because they are Cain, it's their punishment for killing Hevel, for killing Abel. In the study of art, Sarah Lipton wrote an interesting article, very aptly titled, "Where Are the Gothic Jewish Women?" The women were left out of the narrative. They weren't really, the Christians really didn't show that the Jewish women were inferior. So she asks, where were the Gothic women? You don't really hear about them because they were not the focus of attention. The Jewish males in the art world, as we mentioned, were always construed as being ugly. But the reason why Jews were ugly was because, in the Christian narrative, the Jews were so preoccupied with the minutiae of the law, with halacha, with the details of halacha, that they were, sort of groveling in the nitty-bitty of the law. And when you grovel in details, your face gets distorted and you become ugly. So they really believed that because Jews were trying to find connections between things to which there were no connections, where there was no connectivity, and trying to make things fit where they didn't fit, and trying to make new laws and explain why they do certain things, they lost that broadness, that they lost that clean Christian broadness, that openness. And because they were scraping the bottom of this barrel with their legal argumentation, it affected their very image and their very faces. But the Jewish women in the art of that time, when they were depicted, were not depicted as being different from Christian women, which is very interesting. Only the Jews were ugly. The Jewish women were still okay. Now, Christianity now in the 13th century really was 1,000 odd years old. Of course, the rabbinic literature had dealt with Christianity already from the time of the Tanaim, already from the early first centuries already. So the Zohar wasn't the first to polemicize against Christianity. It started already in rabbinic literature, pre-Zoharic times. and halachic sources and Talmudic sources do deal rather extensively with Christianity. If I'm not mistaken, the Gemara references Jesus 51 or 54 times, something like that. In some of the editions, censored editions, it's slightly different. But rabbis had always dealt with Christianity, and obviously never in a positive manner either. Pre-Zoharic rabbinic literature is what I'm speaking about now. But when they dealt with Christianity in the past, it was before the 13th, before the Zohar, before mysticism became dominant, they dealt with Christianity from a legal perspective. So, from a legal perspective, this is now the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is a legal work, also projecting the otherness of the Christian. All right, it takes two to tango, and their narrative was a legal narrative. In other words, can Christians be part of our society? Can we do business with Christians? Which days can we not do business with Christians? Is Sunday an okay day? What happens if a non-Jew, akum very often is an acronym for a subtle reference to a Christian. If a Christian shortchanges you, do you have to tell them that they gave you or gives you too much change? Do you have to return the money? There's a lot of laws, societal laws and economic laws that the rabbinic literature developed regarding interacting with Christians. How do we treat them in society, and how do we treat them economically? And they're not always favorable. So the rabbis had dealt with Christianity. In effect, they had polemicized with Christianity before. But with the Zohar, we get a slightly different nuance, because now the Kabbalists of the Zohar take this old rabbinic polemic against Christianity one step further, and they mysticize it. And by mysticizing it, they actually develop the very character of modern Jewish mysticism, which is all based on the Zohar. So they turn the fight into a mystical fight. But as we shall see, the ideas that they come up with are so predominant and profoundly Zoharic and had such an influence on future Judaism that they shaped the future mystical thinking of the Jewish people, but it was based on this polemic